Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming today to hear our forum, our summer salon on ranked choice voting and other ways to fix the primary program. I'll just give a little background on the logistics for today. We're planning on a 60-minute session. We're going to do Q&A at approximately 5:40. Or thereabouts. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and label them with the word question in front of it so that we can easily see it. We'll hopefully have time to do as many questions as you guys have. We have 3 really excellent participants in this salon and that we're very, very excited about, who are experts in this area. First, I'd like to introduce Ted Dintersmith. He's a reformed venture capitalist, now working at the intersection of education, innovation, and politics. He's written books, produced movies, he's a philanthropist, he gives speeches on this, and actually it was Ted's newsletter that sparked Michelle and my interest in this topic. So in early June, we got his newsletter where he is a huge advocate for ranked choice voting. He's coming out with a book about math, and there's going to be a whole chapter on algorithms and how ranked choice voting is part of that. So maybe he'll talk about that a little bit now, but we'll be sure to put the link for his book as well as the link to sign up for his newsletter in the chat. Next, we have Nick Troiano, who is the executive director of Unite America, which is the leading organization working in this area to bridge partisan divides by enacting political reforms such as ranked choice voting or open primaries. Nick was named in the Forbes 30 under 30 for his work in this area. He's really been involved in this topic. He also has ran as an independent candidate in Pennsylvania. So he's very familiar with all the aspects of what goes into making changes to our political system. And last, we have Sally Hudson, who is the founder and director of Ranked Choice Virginia. It's a nonprofit that provides technical assistance and voter education to those jurisdictions that are adopting ranked choice voting. Sally served in the Virginia State Assembly as a state delegate in the Virginia State Assembly for 2 terms. She was the one who wrote the legislation allowing Virginia to use ranked choice voting. She is an expert in this area. She was previously a professor at UVA. She got a PhD in economics from MIT, and she went to my alma mater for her undergraduate. So we're really happy to have all 3 of these great speakers here. I also want to thank our co-hosts, Ruth Shaber and Beth Siegelman, who are also interested in this topic and kindly are co-hosting it with us. So with that, I think we'll start.
Great. So I think a lot of us are more familiar than we were a month or so ago with ranked choice voting due to the election in New York City. But I'm going to ask Nick to start at sort of a 101 level with us to fill us in on how ranked choice voting works, how open and all candidate primaries work, the kind of mechanics behind that, so we can all get up to speed for this conversation. So Nick.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Michelle and Susie. And I also want to thank Beth and Ruth for co-hosting and bringing us together. It's an honor to be here with Ted and Sally as well. You'll hear more about Sally's incredible work in Virginia, but she's made real stuff happen. And we want to talk about how to do that in even more states around the country. And thank you, everyone, for just making time to be part of this conversation. You know, we are at a perilous time for our democracy. I think that's why so many people are on this Zoom. We feel it acutely right now because there are so many threats and direct attacks on democracy almost by the day. And at the same time, in many ways, those are symptoms of an underlying problem, which is a government that is unable to address the major challenges that people care about. And when government's not able to deliver for citizens, and we see this around the world across time, we get populist movements that gain and entrench power by tearing down our institutions. So really the focus of tonight, and I think this conversation, is about how do we address those underlying challenges? What are the systemic problems? What are the systemic solutions, to them? And so I'll begin by making a maybe bold, if not counterintuitive claim that the biggest problem in our politics today isn't who we elect. It's how we elect them. It's how we elect them. In fact, if you were to give me a magic wand and say, Nick, would you change all 535 members of Congress tomorrow, or would you change the method by which they get reelected? I would choose the latter, and it isn't even close. And that's all because of really just one simple word, which is incentives. Charlie Munger Jr. Used to say that, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Well, the outcome is what we live with every day, the polarization, the divisiveness of politics, not much getting done, democracy being threatened. The incentives are what we're going to be talking about, and that is the product of the way we elect our leaders, our election system. So I'll set the table just by describing three core dysfunctions in our election system, the three Ps that are wrong with our politics and political system today, and some solutions that we're going to dive into probably more tonight. First, the thing that's wrong is partisan gerrymandering. It's the thing that most people know most about. It's the way that our politicians are choosing their voters rather than the other way around by the nature of how they draw our districts. That means most of our elections at the state level, at the district level, are locked by one party or another. The election is sort of predetermined, which leads to the second problem, which is the role that party primaries play. Because if the November election is already predetermined, then the only election that really matters are party primaries. And these tend to be very low turnout elections that are dominated by more partisan ideological voters. And in a lot of states, independent voters are locked out from even participating in them. The third problem that layers on top of that are plurality elections, the third P, which means that you can win a primary or you can win a general election without even having to win a majority of the vote. You just need to have the most votes. So when you have partisan gerrymandering, party primaries, plurality winners, you wind up with what we saw in the 2024 elections, which is that 87% of US House seats were decided in primaries by just 7% of voters nationally. So you have 7% of voters electing 87% of Congress. That's a Congress that is unrepresentative of the public. It's unaccountable to the voters. They're unwilling to work with each other to solve problems. That's the core dysfunction today. It's why we have a Congress with a 20% approval rating and 90% getting reelected. It is a total market failure. So what reformers like Sally and Ted and I talk about are solutions to these problems. If the problem is partisan gerrymandering, well, we can take the power out of the hands of legislators and give it to independent commissions to draw district lines. 6 states have done this for federal contests, have independent commissions. If the problem is party primaries, well, we can get rid of party primaries and replace them with open all-candidate primaries. 3 states have done this for federal elections in Alaska, California, Washington. And if the problem are plurality winners, we can ensure majority winners with systems like ranked choice voting, which is essentially an instant runoff that allows voters to rank their candidates, ensuring that whoever does win has majority support. 2 states, over 50 municipalities have this. So there are real reforms to these real problems that are really winning at the local and state level. And with your involvement and support, we can do even more of this to address some of the core dysfunctions of our democracy. The best case study of this, in my view, is in Alaska, and I'll end on this, which is a reform that United America helped champion in 2020. It was implemented in 2022. It's a top 4 primary, which means there's a single ballot. All the candidates are on it. You get to vote for whoever you want. The top 4 finishers go to the general election where you can rank them, and whoever gets majority support wins. The impact that had was when Lisa Murkowski was running for re-election in 2022, she was being primaried by the far right, in part because of her vote to convict Trump in his impeachment hearing. But instead of being primaried out of office, she got to advance to the general election, won majority support, and got reelected, which means that a true majority of Alaskans had their voice heard, and the Senate has an independent leader in it today. And this system still delivers for the state. Just this past weekend, 3/4 of the legislature got together to override a veto to restore education funding in the state. That would not have happened otherwise if the legislature was not free to represent a true majority and not fear a primary challenge. So the problem is real, but so are the solutions. It doesn't need an act of Congress or constitutional amendment. We can do this at the state level, and I'm excited to dig in more tonight on how to go about doing it.
So that's great. Thank you, Nick. That was really interesting. And now I just want to ask Ted a question here. I know you're, like I said, really a big advocate for ranked choice voting. Can you tell us why you think that's the answer to the problems that Nick was describing?
But I think it's interesting. I mean, I sent my note in June, and that was before we moved from fifth gear to 10th gear on ruining things in the electoral process with what's going on in Texas, which will set off dominoes. And I think people by and large are just disgusted with, and I think Nick had a great way of saying it, with how we elect as much as actually who we elect. And the thing about ranked choice voting, it's something we have control over. There are a bunch of things I think we'd love to change with the Constitution. There will never be another constitutional amendment in my lifetime. Maybe in Nick's lifetime. He's much younger than I am. But a party can do this. And what I said in my note was that, sometimes I fantasize I'm a member of a Democratic Party with bold, competent leadership, maybe someday. But I said, if we just said that no delegates will be seated in 2028 unless each state adopts ranked choice voting of some form for their primaries, that's beneficial in the primary process. One of the things I think that I've observed in races is that the Democratic Party will often try to push candidates out of a primary. Somehow that's a bad thing. Even at the presidential level, I think it happened in 2016. When you have a lot of candidates running a very positive race in a primary, they're all registering voters. So I think a party that moved first and adopted this broadly will invite bolder voices to come in. You won't get these skirmishes between David Hogue and Ken Martin. You'll be registering more voters. You'll have an appeal for boldness to voters. So where somebody's finally doing something to reduce the amount of polarization and division. I mean, we're spending last election $15 billion largely to make America hate America. I mean, that's basically what we do because nobody worries about losing in a primary. Nobody worries about being the center. In fact, if you're not at the very far extreme, you're at risk. So it's one extreme versus another. And boy, I'll tell you, all of us hear over and over from people, it's the lesser of two evils and my vote doesn't matter. And I think with ranked choice voting, we can change that. And why not, right? I mean, the current system is so profoundly broken that something that offers more civility in the elections, draws out more voters, gives a platform for interesting candidates, and actually, we didn't even mention, like Georgia's election, Senate election in 2020, immediately rolled into a runoff. That was a $400 million process. It's just right there in front of us that a party can do. And first mover advantage, I think if a party does it, the other party will fall in line. And it's not a partisan thing. I mean, Sally and I am a longtime Virginia resident. I'm not the biggest fan of Glenn Youngkin as governor, but I think the Republican Party looks at ranked choice voting as the reason they actually nominated somebody who won the general. And so it's worked in states for their one party, it's worked for other parties. It's just like, let's do this.
Yeah, so that just a great segue to Sally. Can you kind of explain your experience in Virginia and how you championed ranked choice voting in Virginia, how you approached the campaign to get it initiated, and what's going on now in terms of the Virginia project and other states that are implementing ranked choice voting? And then we'll get into other options next, Nick, but let's do a little more deep diving into ranked choice voting.
Sure. Thanks, Susie. So I served 4 years in the Virginia General Assembly and authored the law that now allows Virginia communities to use ranked choice at the local level. Like a lot of East Coast states, Virginia doesn't have citizen-led ballot measures, so we're not like California, we're not like Alaska. The people can't just come together and gather petition signatures and pass reforms all on their own. So we have to work with existing elected leaders and the legislative process if we want to make reforms. And that's what I did back in 2020. I worked with colleagues in Richmond from both parties, that can still be possible at the state level, to pass a law that now allows cities and counties to use ranked choice at the local level here. And we took that local approach for a few reasons. It was a practical way to get the process started. Not all of my colleagues in Richmond were sold on the idea of using ranked choice statewide, but they didn't mind the idea if some cities were going to give it a try on their own. And it has allowed us to be careful in working on the implementation, all those nuts and bolts like software and hardware and the administrative details that make it possible to really use ranked choice in real life. And we have seen in those local pilots the promises of ranked choice bear out in practice. The candidates in Arlington and Charlottesville have consistently reported that the campaigns have gotten more substantive and collaborative because the process rewards candidates who embrace what they have in common and allows them to distinguish themselves with their positive priorities. And I think if you don't follow Virginia politics closely, you've seen that in some higher profile races across the country. No matter what you think of Zoran Mamdani's policy views in New York, I think we can all acknowledge that his campaign had great vibes. He was the happy warrior who was bringing people together, and it worked because he was running in a system that rewards candidates for doing that. Ted gave a great example from Virginia. We have a Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin, who won his primary via ranked choice, and it allowed a Republican Party that was very divided at the time to come together around a candidate and send him into the general election with a lot of momentum at its back. And Nick gave some great examples from Alaska. I think their level of bipartisanship now would be baffling to people anywhere else. In the last election cycle in 2024, the Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski endorsed the Democratic candidate for Congress, Mary Patola. And I think that's a level of cross-partisan collaboration you just can't see anywhere else. I think those examples are all ringing endorsements for ranked choice.
Excellent. So outside of ranked choice voting, we also have the top two primary system that has been implemented in California since 2012. That was done via voters in Proposition 14. So Nick, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about the top two. You talked a little bit about top four and what other voting methods are in use, including in Louisiana, which I know is often called a jungle primary. I think you all don't like that term, but that's the common term. So if you could fill us in a little bit more on these other methods of voting, that would be great.
Absolutely. Well, let me talk about primaries and start with a little bit of history, because sometimes we assume that the way we vote today was the way that George Washington told us we had to. But when you go back to the beginning of the Republic, there were no primaries because our founders feared parties themselves to begin with, right? Everything about the machine of our election system was invented at a whole cloth, since then. And that includes primaries, because once parties formed, they had to figure out a way to nominate candidates. And that used to happen in smoke-filled rooms by party bosses. And that led to a lot of corruption. And about 100 years ago, during the Progressive era, they said, hey, let's make these primaries open to all voters. And it was intended to be a democratizing reform, which worked pretty well for another 100 years until the primaries have been sort of co-opted by activists and special interests that don't make them very representative. So there's been efforts to try and open the primaries further. So there's various types. I'll break it down into kind of four categories. 16 states have closed party primaries, which means only registered members of that party can vote in that party's primary. And if you're an independent, which maybe now half the country is, you won't be able to vote in those taxpayer-funded elections. In 11 states, you have party primaries that independents can choose which party's election to vote in, but Democrats can't cross over and vote in Republican primary or vice versa. Then you have 20 states with fully open primaries. These are mostly states that don't register voters by party, where anyone can vote in either party's primary. Now, what we advocate as kind of a North Star reform is what we call open all candidate primaries. So instead of having a Democratic and Republican ballot, you get one ballot, everyone's listed on it, and the top finishers go to the general election. And within that category, you have a couple models. One that you named is top two. So in California, everyone's on the same ballot. The top two finishers go to the general election. By definition, one of those candidates will get majority support. In Alaska, that advances the top four, gives voters more choice. Louisiana is the only state in the country that actually has gotten rid of primaries altogether. Everyone runs in the general election, and if no one gets majority support, there's a runoff. So those are the different types of primaries today, and we're going to be interchangeably talking about ranked choice voting, primary reform. There are ways that these things integrate. So when we look at New York City, they have closed party primaries, but ranked choice voting in the primary. So even though not independents can't vote, you still have a Democratic primary that produces maybe a more consensus candidate than otherwise would be the case. But in our view, it's only half of a reform because it's still a problem that 1 million New Yorkers are locked out of that primary. And so some of these things are incremental in nature until you can get sort of a full package. And like I said before, Alaska kind of comes closest to that because it combines this open primary with a ranked choice voting in the general election.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. That was wonderful. Our next question is going to go to Ted, but please, everyone, feel free to chime in on your opinion on this. The question is, have we seen evidence that ranked choice voting and these other methods have actually reduced polarization? Secondly, do you have any cautionary tales about unexpected outcomes? I know in California, there was a couple federal races where we almost had two Republicans in the top two rather than a Republican and a Democrat. That's always a worry for people in our state. And I know also in Washington state, the race for treasurer, Democrats did get iced out of that a couple of years ago. So polarization and cautionary tales. So we'll start with you, Ted.
Yeah, I'm going to be brief and let Nick. I think Nick has got a better landscape on this, but we're not here saying it's perfect. We're not here saying ranked choice voting will end every issue dragging down America. I think what we're saying is it's one thing in our control to do that would put if you're a Democrat, which I am, put the Democratic Party in a position of exerting real leadership and audacity that would give us an advantage rolling into general elections, would put pressure on states to move it into a general election in different ways. You know, my own bias is rather than tell every state you have to do it exactly this way, to take advantage of some experimentation and let states try different ways and let it evolve. But I do feel like when you look into where it's been done, I mean, a good example, Nick, and I don't know if you were involved with Santa Fe, but they got ranked choice voting in place for a mayor's election and then did careful polling afterwards. 94% of voters said they really thought it made sense, that they were big fans of that process, and the turnout went way up. Now, that's an example, but I think when it's tried and when people get their sense of what anything new always makes people nervous, right? And particularly when you have entrenched incumbents who look at something different as being, well, that might put me under some pressure. If the incumbents are saying don't do it and it's new and different, a lot of people are going to say, and it's got a little bit of complication to it, but it's actually fascinating complication. It means that somebody thinking about voting actually is invited to strategize. How about that? I mean, I think that's actually intriguing. And I think it's something that people will start to think, well, who are you voting for first? And then what are you doing with your second and third choices? And there's just a dynamic to it that makes otherwise stone cold boring elections that are already decided from the get-go interesting and draw people in. And so, but Nick, maybe you can offer, because you're dealing with, I mean, as I said, Nick, I'm a huge fan of what Nick's doing, and they've been working on this issue for quite some time broadly across America. So maybe you want to really elaborate on that.
Sure. I mean, on your question, Michelle, about some edge cases in top two that you mentioned, I would underscore what Ted said, which is there is no perfect voting system. So oftentimes, even reformers can get into here's our preferred, here's why it's better than this. But let's just go back to the status quo. Let me repeat, 7% of Americans elected 87% of our Congress because the system is so bonkers today. In plurality elections like we have, for example, you might have a third party candidate get on the ballot, like a Green or a Libertarian or Independent, that shaves off a small portion of the vote that leads to an unrepresentative outcome in a particular, district. So there are major problems with today's system. In any of these reforms, they are not perfect, but they're much better than would otherwise be the case. And I'll just address, sort of one of the concerns or critiques on the top two primary system, which is sometimes you might wind up with a general election that has two Democrats or two Republicans. In our view, that's not a bug, it's a feature, because that is 99% of the time going to happen in a district that is overwhelmingly Democratic or overwhelmingly Republican. So the primary serves as a winnowing function, and then you get two candidates in the general election, and everyone gets to decide, well, what type of Democrat should represent us, or what type of Republican should. So it makes everyone's ballot much more powerful in deciding who gets to elect them.
And what about the polarization issue? Have you seen signs that this is coming to fruition? There is less polarization or more moderate candidates come out of the process?
Yeah, I would say there's no silver bullet. Political systems are very dynamic, but the biggest change that reforming the primaries does is eliminate the fear of being primaried. right? So if you're a legislator and your only threat to getting reelected is if you're a Democrat looking over your left shoulder, or Republican looking over your right shoulder for who's coming after you in your primary, you are going to be very reluctant to work across the aisle and get out of step with the small but passionate, active base of your party. So if we open the primaries and eliminate the threat of being primaried, that is no longer the gating factor in why common sense bipartisan legislation is not getting done. And there is empirical evidence for this in states that have eliminated its primaries, including California. There was a study at a USC that showed the new legislators elected were about 18 percentage points less ideologically extreme than those elected from closed primaries when you measure their roll call votes. So there is good signs that this is possible. And there's good evidence from the states, like we mentioned before in Alaska, that have done this, where you see much more bipartisanship than you would otherwise.
Could I just add one other thing and I apologize if somebody's on this that thinks what's going on in Washington, D.C. with Donald Trump is great. But just to let you know what the stakes are, if the Republican Party had used ranked choice voting during the 2016 primary, Donald Trump would not have been nominated. If the general election in 2016 had been ranked choice voting, Donald Trump would not have won that election. So this isn't like a little thing, or this is it's too complicated, or I don't like like this is really of the highest of consequence, and we're paying a huge penalty today for a broken system that should have been adapted and modified long ago.
So that just raises the question, there are people that are critics of this. And even on the chat, if you look, some people say, I didn't know that this is how it worked. There's no education on this. I mean, if people think it's confusing, we've talked to people who say voters aren't smart enough to be able to do it. It takes a long time to tabulate it. It's more opaque. You've got Republicans claiming things are rigged, etc. So what do you guys say to those criticisms? And how do we combat against those things that we're hearing people criticizing it about?
Maybe I can hop in and talk about voter education, because that's really our lane at Ranked Choice Virginia. I think the best way to learn is by doing. And once voters actually have a chance to use ranked choice voting, they consistently report that they get it, they like it, and they want to do it again. So if you look at the mayoral race that we just had in New York City and you ask those voters, the voters polled after that primary, 96% of them said that they thought their ballot was simple to complete. 81% of them say that they understood RCV extremely or very well, and only 3% said that they don't understand it well. And that's in a community that has only used ranked choice in 2 election cycles. Around the world, in countries like Ireland and Australia, they've been doing this for more than a century. So if you're used to it, it becomes familiar, and that makes it easy. If we all imagine trying to explain briefly how the Electoral College works to somebody who is visiting from Australia, I bet every single one of us would stumble, and yet all of us understand why we pay attention to Pennsylvania on election night. And that's because we've been living with the system long enough that we have intuition for the incentives, and cultures can build that over time. I think I also find, because I do ranked choice education in a lot of settings, from university classrooms to backyard barbecues, if you just remind people that they rank things in their heads all the time, it gets a lot more intuitive. So, especially when we're ordering food, we get really used to the idea that we have a favorite and a backup. I'm somebody who really likes mint chip ice cream. I understand that if I go to Baskin Robbins and they've got 31 flavors, then I can take my pick and I can have my favorite. But if I go to a concession stand at a ball game, I know they may not like mint chip. But if they don't have it, I don't just walk away disappointed. I tell them what my backup is. And I say, okay, if you don't have mint chip, then I'd like chocolate. That's pretty intuitive to people of all ages and all education levels, all socioeconomic statuses. The idea that you can have a favorite and you can have a backup is really not that hard. I think it's also important to note that the notion that ranked choice somehow advantages more elite voters starts with the assumption that the status quo doesn't. And that's just not true, because our current elections don't allow people to vote for the candidate who they really like. They require that voters have some strategic understanding of the landscape, that they know who the front runners are, that they're not going to waste their vote by throwing it away on a candidate who can't win. And that kind of insider knowledge requires strategy from the voters, and it favors the more engaged voters who are watching all the politicking. And ranked choice vote just frees people from that and says you have the freedom to vote for the candidate that you really like. If it turns out that that candidate isn't popular, then your vote will count toward your next choice. You don't have to know who everybody else is going to vote for to know how you should vote. And I find that that is really empowering. And I have had the experience of giving that pitch to people in lots of different settings. And I find particularly the people who have been most underrepresented and most shut out of our existing political system embrace that message the most quickly because they know that the current system doesn't really give them the options they deserve.
Well, groups out there fighting against ranked choice voting?
So I think there's sort of two sets of people who tend to fight against ranked choice voting. The first is the incumbents themselves. Incumbent elected officials do not like changing the rules that they know how to win on. And having been deep in the trenches of election reform in Richmond with some people who are otherwise dear friends of mine, it is wild to see the mental gymnastics that politicians will use to justify why they just have to make their job easier and why the right thing to do is not to do what's right for democracy. So it is really simply that self-serving. And then I think there are other interests who have something to gain from minority rule politics. So the large moneyed interests that fund campaigns against ranked choice voting are often people who don't want to see reforms that are popular with the majority of the electorate. I will say, because I know we're on a call here with a lot of Democratic leaning folks, that here in Virginia, the biggest campaign against ranked choice voting is funded by the Susan B. Anthony Foundation, which is, of course, the anti-abortion rights group. If we know that the majority of Americans support some degree of abortion rights, then interests that would like to prevent those measures from passing are strongly opposed to ranked choice because they don't want to see majority rule politics, because they understand that majority rule politics is a pro-choice world. So those are some of the interests that we see fighting against ranked choice in Virginia.
Just one thing that was raised earlier, before we move on to some other questions about tailwinds and headwinds that we're facing in this fight here. Do you think any of these reforms are going to counter gerrymandering? I mean, we all have gerrymandering at the top of our head now with what's going on in Texas and the other states. Do you think any of these reforms will have any impact on those issues?
Yeah, I would point really quickly to what Nick said earlier, which is anything that allows more candidates to sneak past the primary stage, then reduces the value of gerrymandering. Because the whole idea of gerrymandering is you're going to draw a safe seat and then you're going to lock in that seat for whichever party is in control, and then only the winner of their primary will have a free pass in the general election. So everything that Nick said, I think, applies here as well for how these incentives counter gerrymandering.
Will say anecdotally, I have two kids who voted in the New York City mayoral race, and they were fired up, and everyone was talking about it. And they knew, who's your first, who's your second. It got people, I mean, they're in their 30s, but it got them really, really involved in a way that I've never seen them be before in an election. So that was nice to see. We've covered a little bit about this, but the political headwinds and tailwinds for RCV and other changes to our primary voting systems. Nick, maybe you could cover that for us a little bit. I know it sounds like it's more partisan, but I'm wondering if Democrats are against this as well, because it's built into their primary system. So who is for this, I guess, is the question, other than voters? Is there anyone in Congress that is championing this, that type of thing?
There's bipartisan support and there's bipartisan opposition. And the fault lines of this are usually those who are in power and those who want to be in power or get more power. And let's zoom out a little bit, because a lot of these topics seem very new and salient and growing right now. But this effort around election reform has been happening in the modern era for a couple decades now, and it's been one of major progress. I mean, Maine was the first state to adopt ranked choice voting in 2016. Then you have some states in the two cycles after that get rid of partisan gerrymandering through independent commissions. Then Alaska comes along in 2020, and Nevada follows suit in 2022. All of that progress also catalyzed backlash and partisan opposition. So by 2024, when there is a wave of more pro-democracy ballot initiatives than we've ever seen in 100 years, there is also a wave of partisan opposition. So you wind up having, for example, in Nevada, a blue state, Montana, a red state, $20 million spent against these citizen initiatives. In Nevada, it was by the Democratic Party, who tried to convince people that ranked choice voting would disenfranchise people of color. In Montana and Idaho, you had the Republican Party saying open borders, open bathrooms, open primaries. It's all part of this plot, by the left. And these are scare tactics by incumbents, to hold on to their power. Now, I see an opportunity, in all of this, which is that while a lot of interest groups and activists are really driving that, there are a lot of elected officials who get into politics for the right reasons, who want to solve problems, that know the system is broken and are, at least right now, quietly whispering to us, I hope you're successful. I can't say that out loud because of all the problems we're talking about right now, but actually do want to see a change. And again, in the progressive era 100 years ago, this is how change happened. It was a bit of from the inside and the parties recognizing the system isn't working so well. And it came from the outside of, at the grassroots level, people rising up against the sort of systemic corruption and dysfunction. And so although we're seeing more opposition than we ever have, that opposition is a sign that what we're doing matters and that it's impactful. And so right now, as we look forward to the next two election cycles, we're going to need to build more support in a stronger way and be more sophisticated to kind of fight this in a real politic kind of way, because it's not just about good government groups, writing indignant op-eds. We have to play on the field of political battle and take on our enemies, support our proponents, and meet the opposition where they're at. At the end of the day, the reason why I think we'll be successful is that the people are with us. When you ask people, do you think you should be able to vote for whoever you want in every election? Do you think whoever should win should get majority support? It's 80+% of Democrats, Republicans, Independents. So we have to play the long game, but I think we'll be successful.
Great. So to each of you, if you could wave a magic wand and implement one of these voting reforms, which one would it be? Can you even pick one, or is it sort of a not one size fits all? What works in Alaska maybe doesn't work in California. What would each of you say to that? Ted, how about if we start with you?
Yeah, I've indicated before, I'm a fan of a bit of experimentation at this point. I'd rather have a state do what they think is best than to have somebody try to tell them it's got to be. But within the context of it needs to be a ranked choice voting strategy. And I will emphasize that after this round of gerrymandering, and then you look at what's going to happen, I hope everybody's aware when the census of 2030 rolls out, there will be another dozen House seats that go from blue to red states. So we are very, very close to the House being locked in to a permanent, red majority. The number of Senate, states with one Democrat and one Republican senator is almost none now. It used to be pretty normal. That's getting locked in. You look at what's happened with voter suppression, a state like Florida that in 2018 was really close. That's not even close. Where we're headed, absent some intervention, is a country that is just absolutely locked into its red and blue corners in a way that I think is going to be very regrettable for those of us on the blue side, but also just means we can't cooperate on anything that matters when we've got major problems and issues to take on. So to me, if I could snap my fingers, which I tried, I would say Ken Martin, DNC, don't let any delegation be seated in 2028 until that state has implemented ranked choice voting in all of its primaries, period. And that would be a forcing function that would mean the Democratic parties in all 50 states would show real leadership and implement a system and then be able to say to voters, we understand it's too divided, it's too polarized, there's too much hate, and you're not getting the candidates you want. We have decided to do something about it. And I don't see a downside other than the insiders of the party might moan and groan about it. But absent that, it's very hard for me to wake up and say, boy, I'm unbelievably optimistic about where things are headed.
And I might pick up there where Ted left off, because a number of folks in the chat were asking some version of the question, how do we actually get this done if incumbents have to change the rules that get them elected? I think that the reform pathway in a lot of states like Virginia that don't have ballot measures does run through the party primary process, because I think that's where even the existing prime parties can see that they have something to gain from ranked choice, because they can see how the process at the primary level encourages the candidates not to tear each other down. And I do think that's where donors have a really powerful role to play, because you can tell party leadership and the people who call you for donations that you don't want to give money that's going to be used to tear down other Democrats. You can say, I want to use a system that's going to allow us as a party to have a robust debate about the issues that matter most to voters, and then come together united behind a candidate to send into the general election in 2028. I think that's a really practical path forward in the places where we don't have ballot measures. I think Nick probably has all sorts of good ideas about what you can do in places where you've got more degrees of freedom on the ballot measure side. So maybe I'll pass things to him.
I like this. We'll just piggyback on each other. So in this, in the states where you're reliant on the legislatures, absolutely allowing uh, ranked choice voting in the primaries, ensuring that everyone can vote in the primaries is also really important. New Mexico, just a few months ago, after a multi-year campaign, was successful in passing bipartisan legislation to allow independent voters to participate in primaries. Expanding the electorate is not only a good thing for democracy, it's in the interest of both parties. You want those voters early on to come with you into the general election as well. And in states with ballot initiatives where we can perhaps be a bit more ambitious, at least on a shorter timeline, I think getting rid of the party primaries and replacing it with some model that works for that particular state would be great. Maybe more competitive states, you want to have a top four system, and states that are less competitive, top two might do the trick. I think the Louisiana model of just not having a primary is very interesting that other states should explore it. It's a way of having sort of less expensive elections, less money in politics, less campaigning, but more choice by the time that you get to the general election. So certainly not one size fits all. And that's what makes our laboratories of democracy quite special. It's the way it's always worked.
I will also use this moment. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about federal politics, but to just hype the importance of doing local government right. If you think about why Democrats lost the presidential election in November 2024, it's because we bled voters in cities. We are not doing a good job of convincing people that we govern well when we get a chance to govern at all. And so I think if we do a better job of local government reform, which includes things like primary reform and ranked choice voting, we can do a better job of electing mayors and city councils that deliver on people's policy priorities at the local level, in their schools, in their housing, in their transportation. And that will do a much better job of mobilizing voters in the places that tend to vote for Democrats when they do turn out and vote.
So before we move to the questions, and we're going to move to people's questions, and there's a lot of great questions and comments in there. I just want to ask you if you could just say what we as ordinary citizens can do. I know that we can educate ourselves, we can advocate it with our friends. I know, Ted, you just said, Ken Martin shouldn't seat anybody, but do you have some kind of advice or things that ordinary citizens, like the people on this phone call, that we could do to help on this issue?
I'll start. You could donate to Nick or Sally. That's a good place to start. As I mentioned with the example of Santa Fe, it can be a local election. And the people on this call have influence in their local communities. And if you get your mayor, your school board, or your town council voted with ranked choice voting, that could be really catalyzing. So you don't have to wait and hope that it happens at a national level. And then to me, I've talked to Sally. I was doing something until the bulldozer came with the National Archives on civics education. Because civics education has been just absolutely eviscerated in our K through 12 schools as we chase, math and reading scores. And one of the things was, could we get ranked choice voting in school elections? Because if the kids are doing it in their high school, then they're coming home and talking at dinner about that to the parents. And so there are a lot of different ways to do this. And trust me, the more you explore it, the more it's just a rich, interesting area. I mean, it makes the electing process take on an element of fascination that I think people will appreciate if they spend time on it.
Well, I'll plus one on that last point, because if you say, Nick, how did you turn into an election nerd? In my college student government, we had runoff elections, and there was a big problem with how few students actually voted in the runoff. It went to runoff. And so we had Rob Ritchie from one of the national groups called Fair Vote, which is a group that advocates on ranked choice voting, come to campus and explain why an instant runoff ranked choice voting would be better. And the rest is kind of history. So getting this into the culture in different ways, even outside of traditional elections, is also a way of socializing some of these ideas. In terms of ways to get involved, I think my colleague will drop a link in the chat for those that want to get more information from Unite America on these reforms. We're happy to connect you based on where you live to any local campaigns that you can get involved in, or other ways to also support our organization. And the other thing I'll mention is that while this is a state by state, city by city fight for now, the way that movements have also traditionally worked in our country is it builds support for some kind of federal action. And there is a bipartisan bill in Congress called the Let America Vote Act, two Ds, two Rs co-sponsoring right now, that would mandate all elections be open to all voters. And states would be free to experiment with how to do that. But that is something that you can call and write your member of Congress about to support.
Okay, so some of the questions in the chat, there's some people feel that ranked choice voting doesn't really do it for them. They would rather wait to see who the two choices are and then reset again and have some opportunity to make their choice, as opposed to having to rank the people right at the beginning. So do you have any response to that?
So we have a lot of experience with those runoff elections here in the South. They're generally understood to be a voter suppression tactic, kind of like the closed primary process, but in reverse. We tend to see that turnout plummets in the runoff round. And so you end up getting the candidate chosen by a much smaller slice of the electorate. So that's why we tend to like the instant runoff, is that it encourages a wide range of people to show up, express their views around all the candidates, and then we find that majority supporter all at once. I do think sometimes if you've got the real politicos who love debate season and want to see them continue to dig it out one-on-one, there's a little bit less of that fun for them. But in terms of broadening the electorate and encouraging the largest number of people to participate, we tend to see that the instant runoff is better for that.
We've got a question from Michelle Kraus, and if you could ask to unmute yourself, Michelle, that would be great. Let's see.
I actually wasn't going to ask this, but many years ago, the now deceased Ira Ruskin sat with me, and because I had voted in favor of ranked choice voting in California, and he went point by point why it was a bad idea. So we're talking about a very learned, experienced assembly person and politically elected. Why would that be? Why would they want it not to change as radically? I just want to get my hands around that, because we talked for at least 2 hours about this, and he was vehemently against my vote in favor of ranked choice. And I'd love to understand what the hill is that we're up against and how we can climb that hill and educate people along the way.
Hey, thanks, Michelle. Who wants to start, Sally?
I surely can't speak to what his particular concerns are. I can say that the most common good faith concern that I heard here is about voter education, because if we're investing in these reforms because we want more people to be empowered at the ballot box, then they need to understand what's going on, or we failed. People cannot be empowered by a system that they don't understand. And so I think that's why it's really important that anytime we do election reform, we couple it with strong voter education so that transition goes smoothly. I think that those are the most common sincere concerns that I hear. I hear a lot of other concerns that are more technical or logistical. I think, Susie, you mentioned briefly people who are concerned about it delaying the results. It's interesting. That's not considered a best practice among ranked choice election administrators. If you were to look at the National Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, which is the nerd center of the registrars who help make sure all of the pieces go well, they really encourage jurisdictions to release preliminary results on election night, just like they will for every other election. There is a tendency in some ranked choice jurisdictions to only release results once all the ballots are in, like every last mail-in ballot that we know takes a while to trickle in, because they're worried that if the ranked choice results shift after election day, that will undermine confidence in them. But voters are already accustomed to the idea that a really close election could shift as the last few votes come in. And my view, and I think the view of a lot of election administrators, is that delaying the results draws more attention to that dynamic and treats ranked choice as different from any other election. I think the better practice that's emerging is just to do initial results on election night, and as the additional ballots come in, update the results like you would for any other election. So that is not a technical limitation. It's a legal choice by some of the initial jurisdictions that started.
So there's also some questions in the chat about money in politics in different forms. Do you think any of these reforms will have any impact in trying to curb all this money that's in politics, from the Elon Musks to the cost of all these elections? And do you think any of these reforms have any part in trying to curb that?
Well, I'll
I
speak
mean, I'll say this. I mean, I think the money, and Sally, I think, said it well before. I mean, the interest groups, whether it's, gun lobby would be a great example where they know they can control a fringe number of candidates in key committees. And so they're going to be fighting this tooth and nail. I'd say this gives us a chance to elect candidates more likely to take on these issues. And would I love to see bans on all the massive amounts of money going into these elections to make everybody hate each other? I would, but again, I want to come back to the point before, is that we could have a long discussion about what's good and bad about purgatory, but when you're in, I have to watch my language, when you're in hell, purgatory looks awfully good. And so I'm wide open. I mean, if somebody says, well, here's something else that could actually improve the way we elect candidates and give more coverage and support to people that are reasonable and in the center, I'm all for it. But this, to me, is doable, the best possible thing we can do. And otherwise, I just see a whole bunch of things going in the wrong direction.
One of the challenges that we see with the role of money in politics is that single issue groups or wealthy donors, stand up ideological PACs that can deploy money that have the most impact in low turnout party primaries, because they have a very small universe of people that they can target. Their signaling of their endorsement tends to matter with those, that subset of voters. And so when we expand the electorate, we actually dilute the impact that those single issue groups have with money in politics. The flip side, just to acknowledge a critique, is that some elections that were no longer competitive will become competitive, and candidates will raise and spend in aggregate more money than they used to. But that money will come from, a wider array of citizens and supporters for those candidates. So it's about how representative the process is, not necessarily just the raw dollar amount, I think, when analyzing the impact of some of these reforms.
I would also add that I think ranked choice voting and public financing are two great tastes that taste great together. The cities that are doing ranked choice voting best are the ones that are combining them with local public matching funds. I just dropped in the chat some really inspiring evidence that came out of Portland, Oregon, which did a massive city hall overhaul that included ranked choice and public financing. You may have seen in the New York City mayoral primary that they have ranked choice and public matching. So at the tail end of the campaign, candidates like Zoran Mamdani were saying, do not send me any more money. I want you to volunteer instead. And wouldn't all of you like to hear that from more people running for office? So I think we should think of these as reforms that layer in a really powerful way.
We have a bunch of questions about how this actually gets implemented. I know we've talked about parties and what they can do. States, sometimes it's a proposition. So can you talk about how, for federal, state, municipal elections, how would this actually get done? How would the sausage get made to implement this? And
Sure. So maybe I can give a couple sausage making answers there. One is I see in the chat that Cynthia asked the question, who has the power to decide on implementing RCB on local municipal governments? This is a little bit of schoolhouse rocks that not everybody knows, but just like your states may have ballot measures or not, another key factor that divides our states is whether they have home rule or not. A home rule state is a state where cities have the authority to adopt a lot of policies independently at the local level. So the reason Portland, Oregon was able to do this massive city hall overhaul is they're a home rule state where cities have a lot of independent authority. Virginia is not a home rule state. We're the opposite. We're called a Dillon rule state. And that means that if we want to do local level reform, we have to pass a state law. That's a real pain, but that's one of the first things to ask yourself if you're tuning in from whichever state is, are you a home rule state or not? Because that's going to tell you about your path to reform. I see also that Jonathan asked a question about how we either build up from the municipal level or whether we swing for the state fences all at once. I think it can vary state to state. I think we have winning examples of both. I think my general default is to build up from local pilots in large part because we do know that voters learn by doing. And so if you can have a big city or two in a state have a positive experience on their own soil, in their own borders, I think it tends to build up confidence among the press, among the voters, among the registrars, and it gets a lot of those boogeyman concerns out of the closet and into the light. And it makes it much easier then to go statewide. So, for example, I think Portland, Oregon is a great, or Oregon rather, the state might be an example of a state that tried to go too fast, too quickly, because they had a ballot measure to try to take ranked choice statewide in 2024 that was on the ballot at the same time that Portland was using ranked choice at the local level for the very first time. I think it's worth asking whether they might have tried to stagger those and say, let's have our biggest city use ranked choice, have it go well, get used to it, and then come back a few years later and try to go statewide with that evidence under our feet.
What I would add on the primaries front is in most cases, this is a change in statute or constitutional amendment at the state level to change these laws. But in many close primary states, the political parties themselves can decide to open their elections up to independent voters. So the Democratic parties in Utah and Oklahoma and West Virginia have decided to do this. In the 16 closed primary states, half, if not more, are Democratic-controlled blue states: Oregon, Delaware, New York, New Jersey, Maryland. These Democratic parties, could decide they control government to be Democratic, small d, and allow independents to vote. They can also decide at the party level themselves to allow independent voters.
Great. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. I feel like we could go for another hour and I still have a lot of things to discuss. So, but it is the end of our hour and we want to respect everyone's time on this beautiful Wednesday. So thank you all for participating in this call today. You were wonderful. Our speakers really appreciate all of your insights. And I think everyone came away a lot more educated on what's going on with the primary problem, etc. So thank you all. So we are going to be having our next salon on Thursday, September 11th, with Jason Birkenfeld, who many of you are familiar with, who's running Project Bullhorn, and Liz Plank, who's a best-selling author, journalist, and social media influencer with over 1 million followers across platforms. She's also hosting a new podcast with Katie Couric. And Project Bullhorn is working to fund and train creators, launch rapid response media, and build infrastructure to reach younger, disengaged voters on platforms like TikTok, etc. So that should be a very interesting conversation as well. I'll drop a link into the chat for that, and we will also be sending a follow-up email to everybody with the video, the chat transcript, and any links that we've talked about, as well as ways to get involved or donate to Nick and Sally, and on Ted's book and his Substack if you want to sign up for that. It's very interesting. Susie and I both get that, and we highly recommend it. So, so thank you, everyone. We hope to see you on September 11th.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and thanks for what you guys are doing. It's awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It was great.
All right. See you next time.
Bye-bye.